Hello, this is Dr. Germ Day Storms once again, and today's mini lecture is going to be describing and discussing the different types of search patterns that are used at a crime scene. So let's go ahead and get started. I want you to know 5 search patterns. This first type of crime scene search pattern that we're going to discuss is the line or the strip search pattern. Now, what's really important here, once again, when we're talking about the search patterns, I want you to be able to give examples of when they are used, discuss the pros and cons. So, for example, does it require a well-defined boundary or not? How many investigators are required to perform this? So, can one investigator perform this kind of search pattern on his or her own, or does it require multiple investigators? In this first example here, we actually have it where one person can perform it. Okay, now it is very important that it has well-defined boundaries. Literally what you do is you start at one edge or one boundary and you walk in a straight line until you get to the other edge of the boundary. In the meantime, you're looking for evidence. Now, you can have multiple investigators that do this. It's important, though, that if you decide to have multiple investigators, you need to walk shoulder to shoulder. And I say this because if you don't walk as close together as possible, what's going to happen is that you're going to overlook important pieces of evidence. Okay, so you can imagine or how this could happen. Okay, and obviously the closer together you are, the less likely you are to overlook it. So the way that this works is as follows. Let's look at the diagram. So for the strip or the line search, once again, you have to have well-defined boundaries. So we see here we've got well-defined boundaries. And you have one person. If it's just one person, you start at one boundary edge and you go to the next one. You turn and you double back on yourself. Turn, double back. Okay? Now, if you have multiple people, which is what this figure is trying to show, what's important here is you want to be as close together as possible so that way you don't overlook any evidence in between. You would walk across from one boundary to the other, you turn around, you flank, and you come back across. So you can imagine certain areas where this would possibly be a useful tool for searching for evidence. Okay? So just think about areas where that could be done. So if we want to recap the line of the search method, first, it can be performed by one or multiple people. Two, it must have well-defined boundaries. And then a third thing is you want to eliminate the space between investigators or between strips. Okay, so you want as little space between strips as possible. Because otherwise, you're going to end up overlooking evidence. So let's move on to our next crime scene search pattern. This one's called the grid. Now, one thing that you should notice off the bat is the fact that it's going to require multiple investigators. Now, many times, people confuse the grid search pattern with the line strip search pattern. But what you do here is you have one investigator, or groups of investigators, starting at one boundary, and then at a 90-degree angle, you have another investigator or investigator start, and you literally perform essentially individual strips at 90 degrees apart from each other. So the easiest way to show this is just to look at the diagram. So what happens here is you would have one person or one investigator start, and he or she will start performing a strip search method going that direction. In the meanwhile, you have another investigator or investigators start, and he or she are going to be going in this direction, and they will be doing a strip. Whenever you do this, hopefully you can see that you're going to double back on each other. And so it forms a little grid, hence the reason why it's called a grid search pattern. And so this makes it much more in-depth searching than just a simple strip or line search, since you're doubling back upon each other. However, one of the cons is that it's going to be more time consuming. Okay, so if you're pressed for time, this is not the best method. However, it's much more thorough than just a simple strip or the line search method. So let's reiterate what we learned about the grid search method. First, this must be performed by multiple investigators that work perpendicularly with respect to each other. Second, you must have well-defined boundaries. That way you know where to start and stop for each of your swaths through the crime scene. And third, although it can require more time, it can be more thorough since you're having multiple people crossing over each other. So it makes it a little less likely that you can overlook evidence. The next crime scene search pattern we're going to discuss is called the spiral search pattern. This one is unique in the sense that you can either start from a point or an origin and work your way outward from that, or you can go from the boundary of a crime scene and go walking in a circle and go towards a center of the object. And so this is a little different in the sense that we actually have two different methods that you can do this. Typically, we're talking about only a single investigator doing this spiral crime scene search pattern, okay? And yes, you have to have a boundary. However, it's much less well-defined than either the line or the grid. Okay, so an example here, let's just look at the figure first. The way that this works is that you have, if you're working from the inside out, you would start at the point of origin, and you slowly work in a spiral pattern until you reach whatever you deem as being the outside boundary. That's much less well-defined than the previous two methods. Now, on the contrary, you could also start at an edge in a circular fashion, work your way in until you get to a central point. So, one nice thing about this is that a single investigator can perform this. But let's think about what the drawback for. What's a con with respect to the spiral search method? And one of which I know that I would have problems doing is walking in nice spiral patterns. I would tend to wonder, what would happen instead. Let me draw it. Many times what would end up happening is something similar to this. You start at this point, maybe that's your body or whatever the piece of evidence is that you want to work your way out. You start walking in a circle, and lo and behold, if you notice here, you don't walk in nice, pretty circles. So the problem here is that you miss or one potential problem I should say, is that you miss all the evidence in the spaces between. Okay? It's because it's really difficult to walk in this nice, concentric well, technically it's not concentric, but a nice spiral pattern. And even here, once again, you can overlook areas of evidence. But once again, there are crime scenes where this type of search pattern yields itself useful. And you can imagine, like, if you're outside, for example, or you have a fairly broad or wide area and it's much less well-defined boundaries and you're by yourself, then you can start doing the spiral search pattern in order to look for evidence. Okay, so starting from the body or the center of the area, and then working your way out, you can look for evidence. The more spirals you perform, obviously, then the lower the smaller the space is between the different paths, then the better it is. Okay, and so to reiterate on this one, what we can say is as follows. First off, it can be performed by a single investigator. Also, the boundaries can be less defined than in the previous two methods that we discussed. You can either work from the inside out or the outside in, meaning you can work going spiraling inward or spiraling outward from a point of origin. And finally, one con about it is that you can actually overlook any evidence that's between the spirals of your search pattern. The next search pattern that we're going to discuss is called the wheel or the ray search pattern. This one must require several investigators. And what you do is you start at one point of origin and you work from that center in a straight line outward, okay? Or you can turn around from the boundary and go towards the center inward, but once again, you're walking in a straight line. So let's look at the figure to describe this one. So what happens here is, for example, if you start at one location in the middle and you have as many people as possible who start to walk out. One person would walk out that direction, we have another person going this direction, third, so on and so forth. So one con for this search pattern has to be the fact that if you look, depending upon the number of people you have, you could overlook evidence in the spaces between the different investigators. So the higher the number of investigators that you have, the better. Now, one other aspect, it's neither a pro nor a con necessarily, is that this search method does not require well-defined boundaries. So you can imagine, let's say, for example, that you have someone who is lost or was abducted, and like a very specific location where he or she was last seen. Then you could start, from the location that the victim was last seen. Let's say, for example, that they were lost. You gather as many people or investigators as you possibly could, and you start from that point of location, and you start walking, looking for evidence, searching for the body or what have you. And the more people you have that's helping out, the more investigators, the less space there will be that's being overlooked. Okay, so let's reiterate the pros and cons of this one. So, first off, you must have multiple investigators. In fact, the more investigators you have performing the search pattern, the better. The boundaries can be less defined. And one con is that the evidence between the investigators can be overlooked. And so once again, this is the reason why the more people you have helping out, the less space there will physically be between each investigator. Next up, we have our final crime scene search pattern. It's called the quadrant or the zone search patterns. What you do is you can take a large search pattern or an irregularly shaped crime scene, a large crime scene or an irregularly shaped crime scene, and you divide it up into smaller sections, which are called zones or quadrants. And then each zone or quadrant has at least one or more investigators that are assigned to it. And so this one does require multiple investigators. It can be time consuming depending upon the size of the crime scene, and also depending upon what search pattern is used within each zone, then it could be more thorough. Okay, and so let's look at the figure that describes this. So what we have here is you would take a large, well-defined crime scene or an irregularly shaped crime scene. You divide it up into individual sections or quadrants or zones, if you want to think of it that way. And then within each zone, one or more investigators are assigned, and then within that zone, you'd have the investigators performing another crime scene search pattern. So, for example, within that zone, you could do, if it's a single investigator, he or she may want to do a strip or a line search pattern. If you have 2 or 3 people that are assigned to a quadrant or zone, you can do the grid within that quadrant, and so on and so forth. Okay, so hopefully this helps to describe the 5 different types of crime scene search patterns, and you can kind of get an idea of the number of investigators that are required to perform the searching. You can get an idea of whether or not it has to have a well-defined boundary or if the boundaries could be less defined. And if there's anything special, so for example, the spiral search method, you can go either outward in or inward out. And you can kind of get an idea of the types of crime scenes where you could utilize these crime scene search patterns. Many times there's more than one correct answer, and I would just be looking for your rationale and your justification in why you would do that type of crime scene search pattern for that crime that you were assigned to.